My name's Robin Simpson. I'm the Public Programs and Education Coordinator here. And before we get started, I just wanted to do an acknowledgement that the activities here at the gallery and the university are on unceded and traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. A few quick thank yous. This event is taking place as part of the public programming around Sovereign Acts 2, which is curated by Wanda Nanabush. And the gallery is open from Tuesdays to Saturdays if you want to come and see the exhibition, and I encourage you to. But also this exhibition is this event tonight with Richard is co-presented with the First Voices Week. And I just wanted to thank Cheyenne Whitebean for working with us to include this in the program. And following this, there is a Cinema Politica presentation tonight of Indigenous led and made film productions, which will be screening across the street in the Hall building in room H110, which is a large cinema on the main floor. I also just wanted to thank Yasmine Tremblay, Hugues Dugas, and Nathalie Blais, who always do a lot of behind-the-scenes work to support all the programming at the Allen Gallery. So thank you to them. And I had in mind, I've been reading and rereading Richard's texts in preparation for his visit. And I was thinking or trying to figure out how I could converse with that, in the sense that a lot of his writing is already so conversant, so I'm so pleased that he's going to be here, often with his peers and often challenging his peers. And so I just pulled one line that from one of his articles. I also didn't want to speak over his writing too much, because I know he's going to be walking through and thinking through his articles, but there are any number of lines and any number of statements and ideas and queries that he puts forward in his writing. But there's one in particular that I read this morning that resonated quite well, which was simply that things are going to stay complicated. So to introduce Richard briefly, who's standing here. Richard's visiting us from Vancouver, and he's a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Studies at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. Richard's taught full-time in the art history program at York University beginning in 2007 and leaving as associate professor in 2015. As a curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario, he oversaw the museum's first substantial effort to include Indigenous North American art and ideas in the permanent collection galleries. Hill's essays on art have appeared internationally in numerous books and exhibition catalogs and periodicals. And his regular column, Close Readings, featuring extended reviews of contemporary Indigenous art, began in Fuse magazine in 2013 and now continues in C magazine. He'll be speaking tonight in part about his regular column at canadianart.ca, and he's currently on the editorial board at the journal Third Text. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you. In case you're wondering, there was going to be a chair on another part of this platform, and I just said I prefer to stand. So it's not their cruelty, it's my preference. Thank you very much for coming. There are friends here and strangers, and a captive student audience who I appreciate, even though you might be here against your will. I think the stories about being held captive by Indians are exaggerated, so don't worry, it'll be okay. I also want to thank Robin and Michelle for inviting me and helping me to be here. And I guess I want to just jump right in, and I should say that this talk is related to this exhibition, but not about this exhibition. So I hope you'll forgive forgive that, and I hope it'll be interesting enough in its own right. I'm going to read a certain amount and talk off the top of my head a certain amount, but mostly start by reading. And so here goes. A little more than a year ago, I began research for a book on contemporary Indigenous art from 1980 to 1995. In March of this year, I began a regular column on the Canadian Art website, I guess I should say in March of last year, through which I have aspired to, and I'm quoting myself here, think out loud in public about questions and controversies arising from this research. Today, I'll add yet another level of, I guess, meta-analysis. I'll be speaking in public, about writing in public, about research that I'm still working on. I want to attend to all those layers as I go along, including my motivation for undertaking this research in the first place, why I've attempted to make parts of the research process public online in advance of the completion of the book, and what it's been like to do this. These three strata, the book, the column, and this talk, overlap in many ways, but of course each also has its own requirements of both form and content. I was drawn to the period from 1980 to 1995 for a number of reasons. The first was a sense that something really important had happened. This was, excepting a few outliers like Alex Janvier, the first generation of Indigenous artists trained in large numbers in mainstream art schools and adopting the idioms and strategies of international contemporary art. It's also a period I lived through and have subsequently taught, but I was starting to wonder whether a gap was opening up between the recollections and contemporary uses being made of art from the period and the actual ambitions of artists at the time. In some cases, that period has taken on mythic proportions, a heroic origin story to glamorize the present. But why had the range of options that artists put on the table at that time so often seemed to have collapsed into rote identity politics? Likewise, taking things from the other direction, I wanted to know what contemporary perspectives might add to our understanding of the period, ideas, approaches, and significances that we could not see at the time. Lastly, there was a lot of work open to do. Aside from the literature contemporary to the period, a few more recent monographic exhibitions, and a couple of short survey essays, the period has not been comprehensively and deeply revisited. My book, as I imagine it now, requires research in the existing literature and various archives, some close analysis of artworks and interviews with artists, curators, and critics active during the period. The task, as I'm learning every day, is alarmingly huge. The outcome will be a book and perhaps an online archive of some sort, maybe even one or more documentary videos. I'm not sure about that either, but it's starting to look that way. The decision to write publicly about the research arose from some of the same motivations as the book, but also had additional concerns of its own. One motive was simply that the book seemed quite far in the future. It was a project I had pitched in my application for a Canada Research Chair at Emily Carr, and when the application went through and I began to settle into my new institutional home, I began to feel the desire for research outcomes that I could share more immediately. My initial idea was to blog informally about the research process. I imagined this would help me think about the process a bit more rigorously than I would otherwise, and also let me share intriguing aspects of the content and methodological considerations that may or may not in the end fit within the book. I assumed there might be a few other people who would be interested in my nerdy reflections, and the more pragmatic part of my brain, which by the way I should say is fairly sadly underdeveloped, but occasionally useful, thought it might make a nice point if I was reporting to Shirk on my strategies for, as they put it, knowledge mobilization. In the arts, we just call that having an audience, I guess. And of course, we're mobilizing knowledge as I speak, which is great to know. I was especially intrigued by the idea of thinking out loud in a provisional rather than a conclusive way, of being willing, in effect, to potentially get things productively wrong in public. Part of this was practical. Wouldn't it be better to make mistakes of both method and content, as well as important omissions here on the fly with an opportunity to be corrected in time for the book? I have also been thinking a lot in the past few years about how hard it seems to have become to speak honestly in public about Indigenous issues if one does not stick to a pretty clearly defined set of opinions and perspectives. I returned to writing art criticism a few years ago in part out of a desire to get used to speaking frankly and critically about Indigenous art in a public way. My intention was not to adopt the authority of the critic, but to make visible my own speculative process of looking and assessing, knowing that in the process of criticism, errors and omissions can be as productive as what one gets right. My hope is to help make a more discursive and less declarative public space for Indigenous art. This is not something that comes easily to me, but I've been working on it. A blog on research where I could test ideas and approaches for my book seemed like a nice addition to that process. So I was on the verge of inquiring about how to start a blog on the Emily Carr website when I received an email from Leo Sandals, the managing online editor at Canadian Art Magazine. She wanted to know if I would be interested in writing for them and proposed a review of a show that was currently up at the Catriona Jeffries Gallery. Because I already had a regular review column in C Magazine, which involved fairly long and involved reviews each issue, I was leery about devoting additional time in my research schedule to reviewing. I proposed instead my idea of a monthly blog about my research. I thought there was a good chance they wouldn't be interested, but decided there was no harm in asking. So I pitched the idea along with a list of potential topics for Leah and editor-in-chief David Beltzer. A bit to my surprise, they were interested, and we began to work out the format. They decided that the term blog suggested a standalone project and wanted to describe it as a column instead. This was fine with me, although the obligation of a column was a little sobering, and I started to realize if I wanted to do that right, I would have to imagine something a bit less freewheeling than I initially anticipated. I really imagined columns that were 500 words long or something like that. Now they're all 3,000 words long. I saw my first task as introducing the project itself and why I thought it mattered, but in a way that would get people's attention. I wanted a really provocative title. My first thought was, has Indigenous art gotten worse since the 1980s and early 90s? But that seemed too negative. So I turned it around and I tried, was Indigenous art better in the 1980s and early 90s? Well, logically, these two questions should have an equivalent meaning. Rhetorically, the latter is softer, emphasizing the success of artists of the past rather than the presumed shortcomings of the current generation. It still gets your attention, though. And from there, I hope people would either follow along to see how I complicated this perspective, or failing that, if they were younger artists, harness their antipathy into resolve to show me how wrong that perspective is through the strength of their own work. So I'm just going to read you the first column because I do think it kind of sets everything out, and then I'll walk us through a few of the other things that I've done, and then hopefully open it up so we can actually talk, which is always, for me anyway, the most interesting part of this sort of thing. So this is, was Indigenous art better in the 1980s and early 90s? During a recent conversation, a friend bemoaned the current state of contemporary Indigenous art. And I have to pause actually to say that this is a device a friend of mine said that I've been using a lot lately. It's a rhetorical device, but it's always true. It's just that there are a lot of people who don't want to go on the record saying the kinds of things that they say, but they don't mind my going on the record if they can remain anonymous. So I've had to do it several times. I'm sure it'll happen again. Anyway, my friend and I were talking about the research I have begun and how excited I am to be revisiting texts and artworks from the 80s and early 90s. Among other things, the period was defined by the struggles of the first large wave of art school-trained Indigenous artists to make space for themselves in galleries, museums, and magazines. The best works of those artists, James Luna, Rebecca Belmore, Jimmy Durham, John Quick-to-See Smith, Edgar Heap Birds, Edward Poitras, to name only a few. Don't ever make a list of artists like that, by the way. Just like paint a giant target on your back instead. Changed how we imagine ourselves and our place in the world. My friend, who has been involved with contemporary Indigenous art for many years, was concerned, however, that the radicalism of the artists of that generation has too often taken a turn for the worse toward a conservative identity politics. This might seem like a shocking perspective given the celebratory atmosphere surrounding the current, relative, institutional success of Indigenous art. There's a genuine sense of debt to artists who cleared space for those of us who followed, and we often want to see ourselves as helping to continue to fulfill their projects. To me, that makes asking critical questions all the more urgent. So have the successes of the radical critical project of the quote-unquote Indigenous Renaissance of the 1980s and early 90s been consolidated into a mannered triumphalism? Are questions of identity now less likely to be opened up and explored than to be regulated and constrained by rampant rulemaking and enforcement in the name of tradition? Might it not, in other words, be a good time to revisit that period to see whether it holds possibilities that have been elided by narratives of institutional success and identity politics? Having begun with a deliberate provocation, I'd like to step back a bit. Nostalgia is treacherous. The past always has the advantage. And pitting artists of different generations against each other helps nobody. I don't think that was my friend's point. While I sometimes despair at how often the work of younger artists is merely a pale echo of earlier works, addressing the same questions of representation in the same way, I don't think this is a generational failure. It's hard to make good art that gets out in front of new issues and perspectives, and each generation only produces a minority of artists who are able to do so. Having recently spent a lot of time looking through old exhibition catalogs, I've seen that, along with iconic works by artists like Belmore and Luna, there are many banal, forgettable efforts by artists that we have, well, forgotten. That's how nostalgia operates. Likewise, among the familiar gestures and cliches of today, there are many outstanding artworks and texts that are opening up new questions and possibilities. The problem is that there is now also a lot of space for gestures that were radical several decades ago, but have become conservative in our changed circumstances. At times, efforts to consolidate institutional power have tended to support conservative rather than progressive work. In accessing many of the new opportunities that have arisen, towing the party line is too often the safer choice, and safe choices lead to bad art. We also need to consider the larger social context of Indigenous cultural revival. The arts played a role, but by far the most influential institutions of this revival began with the creation of Indian Friendship Centers and American Indian Movement survival schools in the 70s. These efforts evolved fairly quickly into state or band-funded Indigenous-run social service agencies and cultural centers. The latter development occurred in precisely the period that I'm researching, and oddly enough, I had front row seats to the phenomena. My mother, a professor of social work at the University of Manitoba, was involved in establishing one of the first Indigenous-run social service agencies in Winnipeg in the early 1980s. In the 2000s, my wife worked for a number of years running a youth art program at Native Child and Family Services in Toronto, where I would occasionally volunteer or simply drop in to hang out. All of these institutions developed cultural programming, and because of the high level of Indigenous involvement with social services, both receiving and delivering, the reach has been very wide. Some of this programming has been developed and delivered by thoughtful and knowledgeable people, but much of it seems to be invented on the fly, often with a generous salting of pan-Indian New Age nonsense and holdover assumptions from residential school religious education smuggled in the back door. In my experience, the less knowledgeable the provider, the more anxious that person tends to be about their Indigenous authenticity, and the more dictatorial they become regarding the proper performance of Indigenous identity. I actually think the art world is less susceptible to this oppressive essentialism than many other places. The people who appoint themselves to govern the boundaries of our identities often take up more space in the conversation than they genuinely occupy, and sadly, people who hold a different view are sometimes cowed into public silence. But art ought to be a place we can work out difficult questions and broach new ideas in public. Excuse me. How does all of this fold around to inform a re-examination of the 1980s and early 90s? So far, and I'm learning as I reread the literature, I can identify a number of key themes in art and writing from that period. One is certainly cultural revival. Another is the critique of colonial representations that is both targeted to specific tropes and to the broader problem of a lack of space for Indigenous art and culture in public discourse. This, in turn, is linked to a project of an Indigenous-focused institutional critique and advocacy for institutional access. All of these themes have been developed with real intelligence, often evolving into genuine institutional change. One might even say, if the term hadn't already been sullied by history, into a cultural revolution. But it may be that each revolution has potential dictators waiting in the wings to claim its legacy and usurp whatever bit of power has been freed up or redistributed. For that reason, I want to add one more theme from this period to the mix, one that oddly seems to be expressed less now than then. This was the common insistence of artists of the time that their contemporary reality be acknowledged and valued. It was often an outright rejection of the salvage anthropology assumption that an authentic identity was only guaranteed by the mimetic reproduction of tradition. It also frequently involved a claim about the legitimacy of being interested and engaged with the wider world. Absurd to have to claim at the time, even more absurd now. We can see that claim about engagement in the wider world in Luna's inclusion of his Motown record collection when representing his life in artifact feats, first performed in 1987, or Carl Beam's explanation of the juxtaposition of images at play in his collages. Quote, if you have your own face next to a rocket, if you put your own face next to the Sadat assassination, this to me implies that one has to have personal responsibility for world events. Or Shelley Nero insisting in a 1995 interview, quote, I think a lot of times Indian people end up stereotyping themselves. They buy into the mushy-gushy image that is acceptable and you know it's safe. Some people think that to be an Indian, you have to do certain things, but I'm just saying that you're an Indian no matter what you do, but you have to decide what you want to do and you have to ask questions. If we can imagine each of the previous themes, cultural revival, colonial critique, and institutional access, shifted to various degrees by this last idea about contemporary realities, invisibly adjusted as though by a gravitational field, then we might be on to something. In Jimmy Durham's 1988 article in Art Forum, The Ground Has Been Covered, for example, Durham tracks both the problem of exclusion from a public sphere dominated by stereotypes and from the contemporary reality in general. Quote, I feel fairly sure that I could address the entire world if only I had a place to stand. Well, some ground has been cleared. Bring on the world. And that's the end of that column. Excuse me, and seems to be partly the end of my voice. So, what happened with this column, as far as I can tell, is that after literally decades of publishing many, many articles, essays, book chapters on Indigenous art, I'd suddenly stumbled onto a forum where lots of people were all of a sudden reading my work. And it was shocking to me, partly because I'm naive about how social media works, because I'm not on Facebook or anything. But as far as I can tell, the column has kind of spread out laterally across a lot of social media and been shared with a lot of people who, many of whom aren't necessarily normal Canadian art readers. And all of a sudden, I've been, getting a kind of deluge of response to it, mostly positive, not always. And it certainly focused my mind a lot because one of the nice things about the old way of publishing was that the relationship to your audience, well, it was nice for me, it's frustrating for other people maybe, but you write something, you send it to the editor, it goes back and forth, you get a final version, then it goes to the publisher, then months later someone finally sends you a copy, and that's sort of the end of your relationship, unless maybe 2 years later someone says, oh, I read that article in my class, we really liked it, or something like that. No one ever comes up and says your article is terrible, so far anyway. Although they do say that about you on the internet, I found. So this was a new experience to me to turn around things so quickly, because you literally send something off to Leah and thinking, well, time will pass, and she'll say, oh, it's up. 2 days later it's up, or a day later. Excuse me. And so that immediacy was a bit of a shocker at first. And it certainly raised a lot of questions for me about how to respond to that aspect. One of the things that Canadian art has is a comment section. And so comments started turning up. The first one was a bit negative from Michael Turner, where he wrote, I appreciate we have to start somewhere, but if the question is, was Indigenous art better in the 1980s and early 90s? Is it too digressive to ask what is meant by better, and later what is meant by best in good and bad art? As I recall, connoisseurial terms, such as these were under fire in the 1980s and early 90s, they are all in play today tells us something else about our current state. As soon as I read that, I did what everybody does when they get a negative comment online. Back went up. I started thinking, oh my God, he's calling me a connoisseur, to which, for someone trained at the time that I was trained, is, you might as well just say, fuck you, asshole. So, pardon the language. My grandfather was a longshoreman. And so that's the polite spectrum of my vocabulary, actually. And so I initially thought, should I write a reply? Immediately I wanted to write a reply. And I was going to write a reply making a complicated thing about connoisseurship and all kinds of things. But I stopped and I wrote an email to Leah and said, do you have a policy about responding to comments? What do you think? And she said, well, sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. Not very helpful, but that's okay. And I thought about it for a while, and I realized two things. One, that the things he accused me of, I feel I had done. I did say what I thought good art and bad art was. The good art was changed how we imagine ourselves and our place in the world, and bad art was conservative and other things. So I felt like that didn't really have anything to do with connoisseurship. So I was safe there, and that I had kind of done what I said what I was accused of not doing. But I didn't reply in the end because I realized that he had probably written that comment quickly without realizing that I had done the things he said I hadn't done. And I was about to reply in a way that was just as quick and probably would have taken the discourse in a not very productive way. And so I thought that it would probably be better if I not be in the comment section having micro arguments with people all over the place that were happening kind of too fast and in too unreflective a way, and that if people wanted to argue with me, it would be better to do it in a more formal way. So I left it at that. I also include my email address at the bottom of every column, inviting people who have information that might be helpful to my book project to be in touch. And so I've gotten a lot in the first few columns. I've got a ton of email from people who have said various versions of, I'm really glad you're saying what you're saying, I'm too scared to say it, or it's really important that you're doing it, or something like that, or I think the same way as you do. And a lot of those people are it goes about 50-50 between younger students and senior artists who I know and respect a lot. So it's kind of nice division. But anyway, and then I got a couple of blistering things, but I won't go into that. But anyway, that's how I've been. I'm telling you all this just to give you a sense of how I've been thinking about it. And I wish I could stop coughing. That would make it a lot nicer for everybody. And I just wanted to go through some of the columns and what seems to have happened with them. As far as I'm able to tell, Canadian Art could tell you how many people looked at how many of each one, but apparently the second column, 10 Indigenous artworks that changed how we imagine ourselves, has been extremely widely circulated and read a lot, which again is one of those things where I'm happy about that, and at the same time a little disturbed that something that I wrote so quickly and seemed in a way to say a lot of obvious things has been so widely appreciated, whereas other things which I respect in a way more tend not to get much attention, but top 10 lists seem to really get people's attention and also make people very angry, because my top 10 list had more than 10 people I left off who could easily have been on the list but weren't, and so many people were angry about that. But that one was a kind of interesting project. And I've tended to alternate a little bit between different kinds of lists of things that lay out different questions or different aspects of practice, and questions that are a bit more methodological. Is there an Indigenous way to write about Indigenous art? And a few quirks. One is on charting my Indigenous art horoscope, which I was really excited about and had so much fun writing, which seemed kind of felt like a stone, as far as I can tell anyway. But and this was a column that I was planning to do later, but I was originally going to do 9 group exhibitions as the next column. But then I realized there were a few gaps in my knowledge that I wanted to fill in before I wrote that one. And so I did this idea that I stole from Arthur Kessler about the idea that you could kind of cast a secular horoscope by looking at the things that were going on the day you were born. I cast a little bit wider net and looked at things that were going on in the year I was born, 1967, a long time ago. And it actually was my way of kind of trying to place myself in relation to the project and get a sense of what was happening and what my relationship to it was. And I won't bring you through everything. Obviously, there was Expo 67. There was a show of Northwest Coast art at the Vancouver Art Gallery that was reported like that. There was Douglas Cardinal's first building, the church, St. Mary's Church in Red Deer, Alberta, which of course is going to, Douglas Cardinal's going to go on to be extremely important because he's going to design the Canadian Museum of Civilization, which is now the Museum of Canadian History, and of course the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. Whoops. So I was interested in all that. And the other thing that really kind of came up for me that I noticed was that there were quite a few artists who were of Indigenous heritage and kind of functioning right in the middle of the mainstream art world without anyone really ever talking about that fact. And the most notable is Robert Markle, whose mother changed his name from Miracle to Markle. I'm not sure who she thought she was fooling with that, but anyway, it was at least a little bit less likely to have him recognized as a Mohawk with that name, I suppose. And Robert Markle is a funny character because he was a kind of classic painter of the 60s and early 70s in that he painted nude women, strippers, these kind of subjects in a wildly expressionistic way, and was extremely famous for that. And in fact, when the BBC series Panorama made a documentary on Canadian national identity in the lead up to Expo 67, it was Robert Markle who rode up on his Harley, got off and gave a cultural tour of Toronto, not as a Mohawk, but as an emissary of high culture in Toronto. So he was kind of right at the center of things. He talked about his Mohawk heritage. He and Gord Rayner did a film called Cowboy and Indian. It was all there. It just wasn't apparently a big deal. So it's very interesting to see that approach and all the problematics of that, but also kind of looking back retrospectively, possibly there might be something a bit liberating about being able to be just a famous artist in some sense. And we might think about what that might mean. The article about, this is the one that's the most art history geeky, I think, about group exhibitions really helped me figure out when things happened where. And I did it in a really, because I have a lot of trouble with numbers, so I need to understand things that happen that might normally be calculated in numbers. I need to see it laid out spatially somehow. So I took all the group exhibition catalogs that I have in my collection, not comprehensive totally, but most of what was going on with group shows about it, contemporary Indigenous art, and I just laid them out on a table outside my office with over a little piece of paper with the date on, and you really could see the very slow emergence of certain things happening. New art by a new generation, 1982, curated by Robert Houle at the Mendel Art Gallery, kind of one of the early outlier exhibitions that started to kind of frame the question of what it meant in the terms of the time to be an Indian modernist. So what it meant to be someone of indigenous heritage who was not working in things that were recognized, although not often actually, traditional arts. And that discourse kind of played back and forth between Canada and the US and Oklahoma especially, up until around 1986 when there were 2 group shows, 86 and 87, curated by Gene Fisher and Jimmy Durham in New York, where suddenly all of this intellectual ferment that was going around in the kind of minority art communities in New York, who were still very marginalized in the 80s, all kind of bubbled into the discourse on contemporary indigenous art to, I think, very helpful effect, along with, kind of POMO theory that was bubbling away there as well, and POCO theory, post-colonial theory. And that introduced a number of artists like Edgar Heapabirds, for example, who have gone on to be considered very important. And there was a little connection back to Canada that happened because Helga Pakasar, who was at the Banff Center at the time at the Walter Phillips Gallery, went down to New York, saw the shows that Gene Fisher and Jimmy Durham curated, and came back and brought half of those artists and a bunch of Canadian artists all together in the show Revisions. And I think that show probably would have had an even bigger impact in terms of bringing that discourse, those discourses together, except that the catalog, although it happened, the show happened in '88, the catalog didn't come out until 1992. One of your worst case scenarios for the delayed catalog. But it's actually really unfortunate because by that time, of course, those discourses had also kind of come together through Land Spirit Power, the big exhibition at the National Gallery, and Indigena. And of course, the 1992 Columbus Quincentenary became this perverse situation where, much like the 150th anniversary of Canada that we're celebrating now, where a whole bunch of resources were put into celebrating Columbus that then, in some cases, got strategically reoriented to shows that actually challenged the narrative of Columbus and the conquest of the Americas. So that's a very important year, and my stack of books from 1992 is enormous. And then you can see 1993, almost nothing. There might be something out there that I don't have. And these are just group shows, remember. There's a kind of gap, and then things start up again. And I think, to me, what defines this period for me is going from a moment when people are trying to figure out what it means for indigenous artists to be doing art that looks contemporary, without apologies, to through a series of exhibitions and group exhibitions that start to kind of try to define that in more and more complicated ways, up until a point when people realize that that's no longer good enough as a curatorial premise. Like, I would call it the kind of what are the Indians up to curatorial show. And occasionally there's still shows like that. But I think by 1995, where you had Marcia Crosby's Nations in an Urban Landscape, which was suddenly asking all these other questions about indigenous identity in a very specific way, to me that kind of marks a boundary where the group show had to be different. And that's how I kind of frame that period. Anyway, I've done other stuff since then as well, other columns, but I think maybe I've talked for a long time now. I don't know. And I'm happy to explore any of the things that I've talked about or anything you've read in the columns that you would want to ask me about or carry this on any way you'd like, basically. Or we can just awkwardly wait. I'm good at that too.
I'd like to ask you to talk into the microphone too, because we'll be recording this, and so to get your question, you have to speak up into the microphone. And there was also, I was asked at the beginning, I forgot to do this before we carry on the conversation, if there are any students of Professor White, you need to sign in. Over here.
Hi.
Hi.
So I was just thinking about what you said at the beginning. You said errors and omissions can be as productive as what you get right.
Yeah.
And I am an artist, and I think one of the things that differentiates artists and art writers in public is that artists are encouraged to fail publicly or to not get it right, and even you also said safe choices make bad art. So I think that aligns itself. But in your position, I'm wondering if you can give an example of something that you maybe got wrong or an omission, and how you went about this, because I think your strategy of thinking out loud in public is really helpful. But I'm just curious how you go about addressing that when you do.
Well, that's a good question. Of course, it turns out that I never got anything wrong, and it's all been good. No, I think sometimes all it takes is to have the thing in print to see where you've made the mistake. You know, there's something about that moment when it's finally permanent, and you go, "Oh, okay, there was more to that story." That's usually what it is. I think in so many cases, it's not so much that you get something wrong, but there's another side to the story that you need to flesh out. And I think that's always one of my biggest challenge that I face whenever I'm writing is kind of you have constraints of time and word count, and and also in a way. Writing that's engaging can't digress endlessly into 1,000 caveats and explanations. And when I first started writing, I always used to start, in my opinion, or I would always qualify everything. It seems to me that and of course it just loads up your writing with all of this clutter. And I've just come eventually to kind of trust that people will know that this is just my opinion, and that it's open, it's open to being disputed. And I guess one of the things that hasn't actually happened, again, as far as I know, is there hasn't actually been a lot of a public response. There are people who've emailed me to say, I like what you're doing, or one person who emailed me to tell me how terrible it was, but it wasn't in a productive way that helped me do better, unfortunately. So I feel when I started writing art criticism, first of all, and started, just saying, I don't like, this work is bad, and saying why I thought so, I was kind of waiting for the response to that. And I know the response is out there. I know people have said things to each other, but it's never made it to the public sphere, basically. And so it's a bit of that back and forth, I feel, is still kind of either waiting to happen or is happening at a kind of quasi-public level. I think this is the thing with things that happen on Facebook and other places like that, where they're sort of public. They're not private, but they're not fully public either. And so, and then there's the things that happen in the conversations you have in bars, and where all the really juicy stuff gets said. And of course, it's important that there be a distinction between what you say publicly and what you say in different private spaces. Of course, that's true. But I think there's not enough of that making it to the surface around Indigenous issues in art. And again, it depends on the context you're speaking in, of course, as well. What kind of issues you want to bring to the foreground. I think I always, again, like I say, when I've learned about shows that I'd overlooked. I'd learned about the importance of artists that I had kind of underestimated, and people have said, well, what about this? What about this aspect of their work? I'm like, okay, that's true. And also, I've noticed at times when I'm when I've said something that's somewhat meant to be provocative, and so the stuff I said about social services, on one hand, you can, people have interpreted that as a kind of attack on that sort of thing, and that would be like literally me attacking my beloved dead mother, who's been gone these many years. So it's not about that, and maybe I could have said, you know, if I'd had more space, or if I wanted to be less provocative, or maybe if I was writing about it in a different context, I might have tried to talk in more detail about that, included more. Those are some of the things that come to mind. And again, I still wait to be. I'm waiting for a public interlocutor. I'll probably be so sorry when I get one. But right now it seems like a good idea.
Hi, Richard. Thanks again for coming. You didn't talk about it right now, but I really enjoyed reading your Art by Indigenous Artists or Art About Indigenous Issues article, and I especially appreciated the timing of it.
Yeah,
you probably
totally
see where this
on,
question is going already.
Wasn't expecting it to be timely at all, but.
I mean, just what you had to say about what it means to be Indigenous, what belonging means, and what authenticity means really helped me to think about the ramifications of the whole Joseph Boyden thing and the kerfuffle around his ancestry or lack thereof. And it seemed like a lot of things that there were to be said about that were already said in your article. And so I don't want to ask you for any kind of verdict or opinion on him or whatever, but I'm just wondering if you had occasion to think any further about things that you said in that article.
Yeah. I don't feel qualified to make an assessment of Joseph Boyden, really, because I've never met him, and I haven't read his books, which I'm not proud of. I'm embarrassed of my lack of literacy. But I do think it's kind of raised a lot of questions, and I feel like there's no way to answer this without getting into the Joseph Boyden issue, which I also don't necessarily want to do. But I guess there were problems with Joseph Boyden, and I think they're real problems. I always have this funny memory of when I was a kid. I guess I was maybe 14 or so, and we went out to one of the lakes around Vancouver. I can't, Bunsen Lake or someplace, for the day. And my aunt brought along this friend of hers who said he was native, as we would have said back then if we didn't say just Indian. And we kind of hung out with him for a while. The kids were just playing around doing stuff, but they were all kind of sitting on a blanket having a picnic or whatever. And we kind of stopped at one point, and we were all kind of sitting around doing whatever. And my mother looked at this guy and kind of did this piercing thing that she could do, like, looked at him and she said, "You're not really an Indian, are you?" And he said, "No." My family adopted, had Indian foster kids, and somehow he had gotten attached to that identity and went around telling everybody he was Indigenous. And it was kind of typical of my mother that she could not only see through it, but just directly say it to him and have him admit it. So I've had this experience of, encountering people who are playing that role for whatever reason, and so I know that it's something that's possible. And it may be the case with Joseph Boyden or not. I don't know how to figure that out. There's certainly a lot of strange stuff on the record. And I think, of course, the other thing about the way he was representing, or was being chosen to represent Indigenous issues in so many contexts, obviously was problematic. In fact, so much so that he's admitted it himself. And that's to his credit, I think, eventually, to figure that out. But I think the other side of that is, I know that whole conversation has made a lot of people really nervous as well, because of the kinds of efforts that people have made to kind of create a definition, and especially because there's a lot of people who have various degrees of connection to different Indigenous communities, or might be quite embedded in an Indigenous community that they're actually not, related by blood to or whatever. So I think all of those things are are still really complicated, and the argument that as I recall it, that I tried to make before is that we should really try to look at this as a kind of aggregation of possibilities, so that the community can be as broad as possible. And at the same time, of course, it's really important that people not represent kinds of positions that they can't, that aren't legitimately their experience. I don't think it doesn't mean that they can't explore them, because I do think art and writing is a way to imaginatively enter the space of the other at times, and so I don't think it's forbidden to try to do that, but I think you need to do it sensitively and in a way as yourself as much as possible. And that was really the kind of argument that I tried to make in that column, was as long as you say what your experience is, that's and you can kind of position yourself in that way. I feel like you kind of have a right to be who you are, and everybody has a right to kind of be who they are. I've never felt anxious about that myself. I've always kind of known that I was in the middle of a lot of different things, and I don't know if it was how I was raised or my own obliviousness or what, but I've always felt like the set of experiences that I have are as legitimate as any other person's set of experiences, and I don't have to apologize for them one way or the other. And they might have a bit of this and a bit of that, and there might be things I know a lot about, and there might be things I don't know so much about. And as I was saying to a friend at lunch, there's certain kinds of Indigenous experiences that I haven't had because of how I look. And so I don't have to be aware everywhere I go all the time that someone's going to be treating me a certain way because of how I look, which is something that my wife has to worry about and my mother had to worry about. So I wouldn't try to speak from that experience, but I can speak from being right beside that experience while it's fucking happening. And that's what I can contribute. And I think if we kind of tone down the kind of anxiety over identity and just allow ourselves to be a bit more honest about what we know and what we don't, and that it's okay if you're a completely, anyway, I don't want to get into all the possible examples, but there's lots of different ways you can be, completely Indigenous by genetics and have been adopted into a white family and raised, there's all kinds of ways you can have complex identities, and we just need ways to kind of respectfully talk between all those different kinds of positions, and those of us who have privilege in these situations then relative to other people need to be aware of that too, just like anyone else who has privilege, whatever the situation might be. That's my passionate, I realize I always get passionate towards the end of my talk.
So in one of the columns, you said if we want to be Indigenous in the present, we have to use all the tools that are to us.
Yeah.
And have the courage to do so. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, talk a little bit about what some of the tools that you're using that might be sort of maybe unorthodox in the way these conversations are generally led. So it gets back to some of what you were saying earlier about the kinds of conversation that you wanted to spur.
Unorthodox tool. I was fine up until you said unorthodox, and then I was like, oh,
okay.
shit.
Maybe unorthodox. It doesn't.
Yeah,
It's a bit strong, but.
Okay. Well.
Yeah, you can just tell me the tools if you want.
The tools. I guess one of the things that I've been trying to do is because to me, I'm trying to figure out how to explain how I figured this out for myself anyway. I think it might have been when I was at the AGO, and when I was reinstalling the McLaughlin Gallery at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and we wanted for the gallery space not to be a kind of European gallery space. And at the same time, there wasn't any kind of clear example about how you would use that kind of architecture and the institution of a museum to not be, how could it not be that? That's what it is. And we ended up doing something that I thought was really, we kind of got there incrementally, but it was radical in terms of redesigning the gallery. And it came out of engagement with the historical artworks that we were looking at from around the Great Lakes, and we were looking at all this sky and underworld imagery. And I was thinking, about what the AGO was like as a space in terms of how it represented the land and landscape, and through the Group of Seven especially, which were really dominantly representative in the Canadian wing, and which, of course, the Indigenous presence was always kind of elsewhere in that work, or going away at best. And I kept thinking, how can you look at this space as a wilderness when from top to bottom it was like occupied completely by the people who, imaginatively, completely by the people who lived there? It's just, to me it was so obvious that the present, that there was these presences all around. And I thought especially, about the kind of Tom Thompson imagery of thunder, and I thought thunder, there are grandfathers, the thunders. And so I really thought, well, how can we show that presence in the gallery in some way without just using the historical objects? Like, how can we translate that to the exhibit design? And I couldn't bring myself to imagine doing it because I felt so scared about tampering with that iconography and that imagery, because it felt like that was something that belonged to someone who was more authentic than me, or knew more, even though I was learning a lot. And I finally thought, I got to just be able to treat this. And again, there are things that are obviously meant for the ceremonial context, and that's not what I'm talking about, dragging all that out into the gallery. But just taking things that had a kind of public presence, like images of the sky world onto the sky, just patterns, not even representational images, and onto the floor to represent the underworld, and then bracketing that whole space within that context. That seemed like something that was important to do, but it only worked because I kind of got over that anxiety about the idea that I could have agency in relationship to those ideas. And from that point on, I really started to think, unless there's a really good reason otherwise, I want to have the courage to treat those traditions, visual, intellectual, not as a kind of set of things that it's my job to simply imitate, but as a toolbox of things that I can actually put into action, that like actually do something for me. It's not something that you just kind of do obligatorily before you start something, where you have a kind of mandatory little ceremony of something, and then you go and do the real work that you wanted to do. That's a horrible situation. And so I thought, well, if I can't get these ideas working for me, then what's the point? And that was liberating for me in a lot of ways. And since then, of course, I've done what everybody else does. Everybody else does this. I've just used all the things that are available. I've used gallery spaces. I've used all the methods of art history that everybody draws from. I've used formal analysis when it was useful. I've used, homo theory when that was helpful. I've kind of thrown it all into the mix, and I kind of trust that our stuff is strong enough to, if we're smart enough to use it well, to sit in that mix and do something. And that's really, I guess, what I mean by that. And it's kind of just a way of shifting your perspective, because I kept going back to the term tradition which is often how we refer to our intellectual heritage as a kind of, as tradition. And so many artists and so many thinkers have kind of deconstructed that idea to open it up and make it into something that's kind of active and that you can engage with and modify when you need to and all those kinds of things. But at the same time, we're kind of up against language, which keeps returning that term back to a fairly conservative definition. And so I've kind of more or less stopped using that term when I can remember to, and just replaced it with intellectual heritage, because I think like an intellectual heritage, that's something you can work with, and it's something that people ought to treat respectfully as an intellectual heritage. It's not something that's kind of bracketed off over here where you go and do your Indian thing. Sorry to keep using that term. I literally grew up on it. I can't, it's hard to totally get it out, especially when I start to feel casual. But if it's something that can kind of, bump up against all kinds of other ideas, change those ideas, be changed by those ideas, then it's exciting to me, and it's what we're all doing all the time anyway. So like, let's just be frickin' honest about it. See, I get passionate toward the end.
Hi, Richard.
Hey, Heather.
That was great. I have been really enjoying your articles over the last year, because it's true, we don't have enough of this kind of public discourse, and you're not on social media, but it does get shared a lot on Facebook whenever they come out.
So I hear, yeah.
And I probably would have asked you this on Facebook if you were on social media, but you're not. So I will ask you here. Maybe you can guess what my question is.
I think I can, yeah.
I bet you can.
So should I just, ask it anyway.
All right. What's up with the no Inuit art in anything, really?
It's a good question. And actually, I've been kind of waiting to have this conversation with you, although I didn't expect to do it right here in public. But
well, you did ask for it, so
yeah, no, I did.
You specifically called.
No, and I'm happy to do it. And my answer is not really as good as it could be, but like the hardest decision I made basically when I took on this project, you may totally find this answer unsatisfactory, so I find it sort of unsatisfactory. One of the things that I've learned in life is there's no, almost every choice you make is unsatisfactory on some level. But the issue that I grappled with at first was how wide to cast my net in terms of not who was doing stuff, but what kind of stuff they were doing. And so my idea was, as I kind of laid out in the beginning, was to look at artists who were working for a kind of, and in a contemporary, trained in art schools, working in a contemporary international art idiom. And that bracketed out a lot of people who were active at that period, not just who were Inuit, but all kinds of people like Norval Morrisseau and all of the kind of people working in that tradition, a lot of people who are working in kind of traditional arts in the Northwest Coast, and a lot of other people. They're all not in my book. And I would be interested to know if, and the artists that I've thought of including, and I just, this is an ongoing thing, so it may be the case, but is Zach and Igluluk Isiuma, who did kind of get absorbed in the exhibitions that were happening. They were kind of treated as contemporary artists in that situation, although so was Robert Davidson and other people. And you can make a case for whether I'm making the right choice. To me, it's the difference between an almost impossibly huge book and an absolutely impossibly huge book. But I kind of put that bracket in. It's excluded a lot of people. I don't see this as, I see this as a kind of, a focused slice through a history, I guess. Again, it's inadequate to say that, but it's mainly for that reason. And I've had to really think about what it would mean to include Zacharias Canuck and Aglulik in it, whether they were aiming towards the art world or they just kind of got caught up in it because there was a kind of need. One of the things that was really interesting that I found actually when I was in the Indigenous archive is there was a meeting where Gerald had pitched the show, Gerald McMaster had pitched the show Indigenous 1992 exhibition, curated by two Indigenous curators, Gerald McMaster and Leanne Martin. And they had curated the whole show and put the proposal forward to the programming committee, and it came back and said, you must have Inuit artists in the show. It wasn't their intention to include an Inuit artist. And so then the list came back, and it was like all these named Southern artists, and then it just said Inuit artist, Inuit artist, Inuit artist. And you kind of expect non-Indigenous people to do that, but to me that was a sign that these were like worlds apart. And so I'm, at some point I'm going to, when I write the book, obviously I'll talk about the methodological choice to cast the net the way I did, but I'm not sure how to include Inuit artists in this without it looking kind of like Inuit artist, Inuit artist, Inuit artist.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think maybe, and I hear what you're saying about Zach Kunik too, because his intention is not really like a contemporary art. He's in a class of his own. But maybe like David Rubin Piktukin and his brother Abraham Ongik Rubin, they had a couple of major shows in the early 90s, and it was like, addressing residential schools history and looking at colonization. I think they would kind of fit into your thesis.
Yeah, probably. I thought about Dave. I know.
Alatu in Reservation X.
Yeah, but it was
He's a writer, not an artist.
Yeah. No, that's an important text, obviously.
It is. Yeah.
I have to think about it more. Again, I don't want to I like David Rubin's work.
Yeah, I mean,
to
I
me,
guess
it still looks like to me he's more doing something like Robert Davidson might have done, where it's kind of straddling a line but not really across it. But maybe maybe it would be worth at least talking about a few outlier cases just to kind of show where the blurry parts of the line are. So it's always good to do that.
for sure.
Hey, thanks for the tough but really good question.
Thanks again for the great talk. I had a follow-up question about the knowledge mobilization project. And just wondering, if you could say something about how it may be changing the way you're thinking about the book, whether or not the book is starting to feel a bit boring now that you're sort of processing all these issues online in these kind of quick and satisfying pieces, or also if you're feeling more cautious about the essays as time goes on, given some of the responses that you may have received.
No, I don't feel more cautious. I mean, I was again talking to Jason at lunch about how occasionally I stray into writing fiction and how liberating it feels to suddenly be unshackled from the caution that permeates every aspect of my writing because everything I write about is so politicized and controversial. So I'm certainly aware of that, and I try to get it as right as I can. In terms of the relationship between the articles and the book, I guess one thing I've come to the conclusion of is that the articles are going to reach way more people than the book ever will. Kind of when I realized that, I thought, this is really strange. Like, this is the impactful part of the project. But probably a bunch of students will end up being obliged to read the sections of the book, or at least cut and paste from it to write their papers. So that's been a funny thing to think about. I'm actually really. There's a real difference between what's going on in the columns and what's going to go in the book, and and at first I was a little worried. I'm going to use up all my content, and then I'll have a book that no one wants to read. But the book is just by the nature of it being the kind of art history that it is going to be a lot more detailed, a lot more careful, a lot more scholarly. Probably, I don't want it to be boring. One of the things I wrote about was, the fact that I feel like there's so much drama in the events that happen, and it would be a real pity to lose that drama for the sake of academic seriousness. But at the same time, I want it to be intellectually rigorous, and I really do want to try to balance those things so that it's a good read, and not at the expense of its intellectuality, but as a way of showing the kind of role of what are sometimes dramatic events in shaping how things turn out. And when you have, it makes a huge difference. One person in one institution shifts the course of this whole discourse because it's so small. And Land, Spirit, Power, for example, whatever problems people have with that show, it kind of realigned the planets in terms of what people were willing to kind of take seriously. And there's a kind of moving card in the Land, Spirit archive from Alex Janvier to the curator, Diana Nimiroff, saying thank you for risking your career by having this show. Now, I don't think Diana Nimiroff thought she was risking her career, but Alex Janvier thought she was risking her career by showing his work in the National Gallery. So, that's, to me, that's kind of powerful. And so I think all of that's there. I'm going to try to get it into the book in stories. I'm looking forward to being able to do that writing. I enjoy that kind of writing too. Either of these to me are kind of equally challenging and difficult, and just difficult in different ways. So I'm happy with both, and they'll both be very different things. And I'm still, I still have a lot of faith in the value of that kind of book project, even if all anyone reads are the top 10 lists on this column.
Thank you. Hi, this is Alice. Thank you, Richard, and also thank you, Jill, for your question, because I was all this while thinking I really want to ask you about one more tool that could possibly be in your toolkit, and that has to be with actually the two very different kinds of writing that are involved in the column, and then the eventual book project, because of course they're having a conversation with each other because they're by you, the same person, but at the same time I think that there's this sort of the time that passes, right, for it to be, for all of these different pieces to be compiled into one entire project that needs to be sort of tightly pulled together. But when you're writing these columns, I can't help but think that one of the risks is that because you're writing a weekly, it has to be sort of...
It's not weekly. It started off as monthly, and I've moved it to every other month because monthly was...
And you're moving into every monthly, but it's still more than, less time than 4 years, right?
Yeah.
That's expected for a book to come out.
Yep.
But one of the questions I had was how there's always a risk for this writing that takes less time than it would for a longer article or a book, let's say, to be thought of or charged with the criticism of being reactionary. And I can't help think, it's a challenge for me right now. I'm on sabbatical and I'm supposed to be writing something very academically rigorous and intellectually sophisticated and whatnot. But I think that we can all agree that this beginning of this year, this solar calendar year, is, it's quite a polarized, divisive kind of context, the circumstances, the situation. Quite devastating in many ways, definitely frustrating. So I just was wondering in your toolkit, if there is sort of a something in there that helps gauge how the question of emotion comes into the writing, and how, what is the tipping point of in being empowered through affect to write about politically engaged topics, but without it coming across as that word reactionary. Do you know what I'm trying to ask?
I think so.
That challenge?
Yeah. It's a huge question. And of course, I'm turning 50 this year, and so I was raised not to display affect. that was the go-to move for all men that I knew growing up. Tone down that affect. You don't want to look like a girl. That was the position of the time. I don't endorse it, but I do embody some of that. But in a way, I'm kind of trained prior to the rise of affect theory too. So I'm theoretically a bit disabled in that area. But I guess to me, it's always been there's always this line that I feel like I don't want to call it a line. It's not, but I am emotionally engaged by the material that I'm writing about. There's no question about it. I'm sure you've gotten a sense of it from the way I've been talking. And, I really feel immense kind of passionate gratitude to the people who've gone before me and put all these ideas and images on the table for me to work with, and many really important things happened because people stood up and kind of tried to help make them happen. And a lot of those people, this is the last column in a way, one of the things that I wanted to acknowledge is that, of course, it was these amazing efforts of artists and Indigenous writers and other people, but also there were a lot of people in institutions who were the ones who said, okay, you can have this first show, or you can, it was a problematic situation that they were in charge of deciding that, but it was also the reality. So there was no other way it could happen except for people like Gene Fisher to get Jimmy Durham to write for Art Forum, or for Karen Dufek to do Beyond History, or whoever, how that's a complicated history anyway. But so I think all of this is, I have a very emotional claim to all those things, and I try, I try to let it be there in as much drama as seems reasonable, and that's kind of where it sits. But in relation to the kind of recent politics, I mean, to me, this really has thrown me off, and I don't know how to respond to it properly either, because for a while now, and in this audience, I feel like I'm still safe to say it, I feel like we could have deeper conversations because we didn't need to talk about the fact that colonialism was terrible all the time. Like there was a kind of, we could have that conversation, but we'd just be talking to ourselves about stuff we already knew. In which case, why not take it to the next level and ask more challenging questions? Now that we seem to be, possibly pivoting back to a situation in which certain kinds of language about, well, not language, fuck, if only it was just language, language and actions around people's racialized identities, for example, have been set back in a way that I would have thought unimaginable, and so that means now I feel like I'm in a process of trying to figure out, well, how do you speak in that situation? And I've just again been kind of struggling with this. I had 2 talks lined up for one at the Hammer Museum for the Jimmy Durham show there in Los Angeles in March, and then another one in New York for an event. And I canceled both of them the other day just because I didn't think it was right to treat what was happening in the U.S. as I didn't want to normalize it. I watched Theresa May have her meeting with Trump and legitimize his presidency through her her willingness to go to him and invite him back to meet with the Queen and all those things. And I thought, this is the most horrible thing to treat this as a normal situation. And so I thought, well, I don't want to treat it as a normal situation. And so I just canceled them. And I haven't heard back from the Hammer yet, so I don't know what that means. But my friends in New York who are Indigenous and who invited me were saying, don't hurt us, don't, you know, like you're just hurting us, you're not hurting him, so you should come. And so I'm in the middle of this moral dilemma about what to do about that. You know, there's no easier way to get me to come than to say, hey, we think your writing is important and we need to hear it. I was like, oh, great, wow. You know, so you feel valuable, well, it could be better. And at the same time, you know, then to be able to actually do something if it's helpful, you know, what a great thing. But at the same time, I still feel torn because I don't want to go down there. I have this like visceral gut reaction to not let, you know, to just, I don't know. And what that will do to my project, I have no idea, because I was planning to spend my whole spring traveling around the U.S., going to archives where shows happened and interviewing artists, and I don't know what to do about that. So I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. I have a question that kind of jumps off from Jason's and then tag teams with Heather, so hopefully that will be useful.
Sounds like I'm going to get the crap beaten out of me.
You're looking for your
The tag
interlocutor?
team.
I'm here. No, I'm just kidding. I wish. My question was actually methodological, because when you describe which tools that you need to use all the tools at this moment, and I think it's true, especially when we're looking at what's happening within the media sphere and absence of political intellectualism, and seeing you step forward this way is sort of a gesture towards moving that forward. But I look at what you've written, particularly on Canadian Art Online, and you're using one of the #1 tools of the internet, which is the listicle.
Yeah.
And the listicle, in my own arena of sort of interests, Tara Rogers really describes the danger to women when we make these lists of these are the top 10 women in electronic music, and that's kind of my world. And she describes why that listicle not only suggests exceptionalism, but it also is exclusionary, and it puts people in opposition to one another that are already in an isolated environment, or potentially being cherry-picked as token inclusions within, in my world, in male music festivals. They might, we read a listicle that told us this lady could do something. And I'm wondering, when working with online publication, you enter into those tools of writing that you've described as quite distinct from what will happen within your academic texts. But is there a usefulness in this towards the creation of a canon, or is there an exclusionary process that happens that might be ultimately more damaging?
There's always an exclusionary process, right? Whenever you pick one thing, you cast aside another. It's, again, you're obviously touching on something I'm sure you can imagine that I struggled with a little myself. And when I first talked to Leah, she said, you should, why don't you do, one of them should be a top 10 list. Those are really popular. And my first thought, it was happening by email, so I had time to think instead of just saying, hell no, I'm not doing a fucking stupid list. But that was exactly my feeling about those lists. And I, you heard me express a bit of reservation about the way that has circulated. And I thought about it for a while, and the weird thing that happened was that actually it was like actually a really interesting process to try to produce that list. I have to be honest and say, because I really had to figure out, what I really value. When you only have 10 things or however many you do, you really have to figure out what really matters to you. And I tried, I did a lot of, if you read it, I'm sure you noticed I did a lot of backing and filling to kind of explain this is just my list. It's not, it's not the list. There's 10 other artists who could easily be on here, more probably. But these are the ones that meant something the most to me. And It turned out, I'm still not sure how I feel about them. I'm still making them. But people really wanted to read them. And that one especially was, people were really engaged by it. So it was hard to kind of argue with that when what I was trying to do was get people's attention to these works. And the thing that really surprised me was how many people told me, I didn't know about that work, or I've been using this essay because there's nothing else to use. And I thought, this is terrible, there's nothing else, I mean, surely there must be, but this was something that was accessible, and it's problematic. It's problematic that it's the thing that people use. At the same time, again, I was trained to be suspicious of canons, and I do, I think there are all kinds of things that get left out, and it's really interesting to kind of open up and try to figure out what's being left out and what else might be interesting, and how, at the same time, I do have my own sense of that some works are more valuable to me than others, done more interesting, more engaging. So I do make those discernments, and we all do, I think, anyway. I mean, if there's someone who's so saintly that they go, with no expectation and no judgment to every artwork and just totally experience it for what it is, that must be something. But for myself, I feel that those kind of, I'm making those judgments, and I guess this comes back to why I feel criticism is important still, despite the fact that we were allegedly in a post-critical period. But I feel like if art matters in the way that we say it does, that is, that it has social and political consequence, then doing it well or badly must matter. Like, it must matter. So if we're doing it badly, someone's got to say something about it to try and get it going in a better direction. It doesn't mean there's someone, again, like, I don't want to be the arbiter. It all should be able to be on the table, but at the same time, we should be able to say, you know what, that's a bad direction. That's not helping us really. That's just recycling something we already know, or it's a it's just a stereotype that we've adopted for ourselves, or something like that. So I think that kind of ability to try and discern what's valuable is still important, and sometimes that means excluding things that you think aren't valuable. That must be enough. You got your money's worth.
I had a question, if that's okay.
Because I'm just here for the money, because they pay big bucks. It's like, flew me out first class.
I had again, a methodological question, and I think it spins off of a bit of what Jake was talking about. These are all combined questions now, and Alice as well. And just asking, in one of your columns, you describe nostalgia and identifying the blind spots of nostalgia. And you're, of course, doing a retrospective project of sorts, at least a retrospective vantage. And I mean, my sense with art historical projects is that, of course, there's a historical narrative that needs to be told or returned to or reevaluated, but that you're always departing from the present to do that, which means the present's in the rearview mirror. So in what ways is this project, this book project, or if it's expanded through these documentaries you spoke of, and possibly in other forms as well, in what ways are you imagining or hoping that this retrospective project is going to resituate the present and how we're understanding practices today, and just our immediate sort of milieu as well, and the conversations that are happening, and how institutions behave and operate?
That got complex at the end there with the institutions. I guess I said I spoke a little bit to this in the in my presentation, but I really feel that of course, we're always interested in history for current reasons. and but at the same time, what that that history isn't kind of arbitrary. Artists created little bombs of meaningfulness, and they left them strewn through that history. And so when we reconnect with them, there's every chance that they're going to kind of redetonate for. I can't believe I've gone off on this bomb metaphor. But that they're going to have that kind of sense of, that they're going to still have that potency, and that you can kind of tap into that potency and make it meaningful for people now. And to me, as I said, one of the things that I feel like is valuable at this moment, when there's such an emphasis on kind of self-conscious traditionalism and all these kinds of things, is the fact that the project of those artists was not always that. And it gets kind of treated as the kind of avant-garde of self-conscious traditionalism. But in many cases, the things that Carl Beam was saying, the things that other people were saying, weren't that. They were saying, I want to be myself, but I want to be engaged in all these things, and I want to go out into new things. So I think that's important to kind of keep in mind. And of course, I'm reducing it to caricature now by saying the present is like this and the past was like that, because there are all kinds of people who are doing exactly that. Many of them are sitting right here in this audience, and are still doing that kind of work. In terms of the danger of nostalgia, to me, especially because this is a history I've lived in, which I feel deeply implicated in, and I'm not, I have a very partial view of it in the sense that I have commitments within it. And there are certain people probably I could never totally get. I think of my first meeting with Rebecca Belmore when I was an art student, and she was this seemed to me incredibly glamorous young woman who was doing all the, just doing all this stuff that seemed so urgent in such interesting ways. And I don't know if I can ever dispel that aura from her or from Robert Hoole or from these people that I kind of encountered when I was still getting my own intellectual shit together. And so those are all things that I'll struggle with. But I mean, again, to me, it's always, you try to identify those as things that you're struggling with. If you need to mention it, you mention it, and you just work through it. And hopefully it will be valuable to people. I use books that I feel like we really need the resources for teaching. We need the resources. People need to have the history. So I think all of that. I think it's going to be valuable. It would be valuable to me if someone else did it and I could use it for my teaching and my research and other things. Okay, now that's enough.